sorry this is late. I've been kind of busy with school, and today was a day I just needed to get something done. Hi! So, it is another Disney Snow White fact video, and this one's all about the Snow White characters. Doc, he was played by Rory Atwell. Happy was played by Otis Harrelson. Sneezy was played by Billy Gilbert. Sleepy and Grumpy were both played by the same person, so there they are right there next to each other. They were both played by Pinto Colwig. Bashful was played by Scotty Matraw. And finally, Dopey. Know that he was played by Eddie Collins. Okay, and then the Huntsman was played by Stuart Buchanan. And the Prince was voiced by Harry Stockwell, and the Witch / Evil Queen were played by Lucille Laverne. Snow White was played by Adriana Caselotti. There were 21 pages of notes entitled Snow White Suggestions, which were compiled by Richard Creedon on August 9th, 1934. The movie was supposed to start with scenes that had Snow White's mom in them, but they had to be cut. There is a picture of Snow White's mom. There are only 11 human characters, and the Prince is the only one not named. The Prince was originally a much more prominent or major character, but the animators had a hard time animating him, so they had to cut his part significantly. And the Prince was also supposed to be very comical and clowny and was supposed to be the comic relief of the show. Alan Jones, Douglas MacPhail, Dennis Morgan, and Felix Knight had auditioned for the role of the Prince, but it ended up going to Harry Stockwell. Fact number 8. The dwarfs do not leave Snow White's side after she eats the apple and she's in the coffin, but the Prince knows what happened and where to find her. So because he doesn't have any names, he's known as Snow White's Prince Charming. So there is some debate about if he does have a name, and if so, what his name is. In 1938, at the awards on the Oscars, Shirley Temple presented the award to Walt Disney, and she mentions Ferdinand, and people thought that maybe she was referring to the Prince, but apparently there was like this mini series or something about Ferdinand the Bull, which is written by Dave Smith, and then Prince Florian is in Disney France on a TV spot. He's referred to as Prince Florian, and Disney on Ice sometimes uses that. And then there's also some debate about whether he might be named Frederick or Henry, spelled both the French way and the English way. And the only fact for the Huntsman is his name. He is named Humbert the Huntsman. The Magic Mirror also only has one fact. The spirit of the Magic Mirror's voice was created by having Muronite Olsen, I didn't mention that, but that's who plays the Magic Mirror, Muronite Olsen. He speaks his lines while wearing a box frame covered with old drum heads over his head, and that's how they got his magic, spiritual, big voice. And the Queen, let me show you the picture again. Lucille Laverne, the voice of the Wicked Queen, was told by the animators that for the old witch's voice they needed an older, raspier voice. So she stepped out of the booth and then came back and redid her voice, and it was perfect. How did she do it? They asked her, and she said that she had taken her dentures out, her teeth out. They took them out. She took them out and was able to play the older witch. Queen was also supposed to be fat and ugly, but Disney thought that she needed to be stately, beautiful, and a gorgeous type, and someone who can be competed with Snow White. like Snow White can be they can be Snow White's competition, even though Snow White is always the fairest of them all. The Queen was going to have the prince marry her before she poisoned Snow White, and then was going to leave him to die in a chamber filling up with water because he was supposed to reject her. And it was also and the film was also supposed to include all three of the Queen's original assassinations in the original story, including the poison comb, the bottle suffocation, and the poison apple. That it just became the apple, and originally only the bodice was cut, and it was the apple and the crown, but it ended up just being the apple. And the last one for the Queen is, you know that scene at the very end where the Queen dies and the witch is on is on the cliff and it's struck by lightning. The splashes of the rain on the rock wall behind the boulder are seen over the rock instead of behind it. And apparently it was because the cameraman had placed the cells in the wrong order. And I watched a video about how they do this, and that you're supposed to put like a picture of Snow White or like the background, then Snow White, then the animals, and like in a certain order. And the cameraman, and then they take a picture, and the cameraman had placed them in the wrong order. And so he put the splashes over the boulder instead of under the boulder, and so it's really clear as the boulder rolls off the cliff. The dwarf. We have a lot of facts, but they're the dwarfs. So when Snow White was released, the correct English word for the plural word of dwarf was dwarfs, spelled D-W-A-R-F-S, just like it is in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. But many people now go by D-W-A-R-V-E-S, and that was because of J.R.R. Tolkien's his books, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, which use dwarves, and then that became the plural word, the popular plural word. And so now Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is also interchanged with Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. So it goes back and forth. Also, the word dwarfs or dwarf is only used two times in the movie. Once by the magical mirror and once by the hag. So it took 2 years to come up with the final drawings and names and stuff of the Seven Dwarfs. Here are several of the many names that people came up with for the dwarfs' names and personalities, and they're supposed to be about the same, like Grumpy is grumpy. So there were 50 ideas for these names, and it included all the ones finally used except for Dopey and Doc, and Dopey and Doc come up with later. So here are the names.
Wiggy Wiggy, Biggo Eggo, Awful, Blabby, Deefy, Dirty, Gabby, Gaspy, Gloomy, Hoppy Jumpy, Hotsy, Jaunty, Nifty, Sniffy, Busy, Crabby, Daffy, Dumpy, Flabby, Helpful, Lazy, Scrappy, Sniffy, Snoopy, Stubby, Thrifty, and Wheezy.
And Sneezy was a last-minute replacement for Deefy. And then there's also Happy, Grumpy, Sleepy, and Bashful. And then every country has its own translation of Snow White. And it also includes the 7 names of the dwarfs, including Germany, which in the original story, there aren't any names given to the dwarfs. Fact number 22. Dopey was the last to be developed, and some of the animators were against the name Dopey because they thought it was too modern a word for a timeless fairy tale, meaning it was supposed to be a movie that can be shown at any time, and no one, even in the past, and no one feels like it's incorrect at all. So Disney kind of, I think, lied to them. He told them that William Shakespeare had used it in one of his plays, which convinced them, but still no one can find they can't find the term anywhere in his works. So Disney lied. So Mel Blanc, now if you don't know Mel Blanc, he's cast in several things, and he's most famous for Bugs Bunny. He was originally cast as Dopey, um, but then he became mute instead. Here's another fact about Sneezy. Billy Gilbert, the comedian, found out there was a dwarf named Sneezy, and he called Walt up on the phone, and he gave him a Sneezy gag, and he got the part. So, Sterling Holloway was considered for the role of Sleepy. Spoonerizing comedian Joe Twerp was considered for the role of Doc, but the part went to Roy Atwell instead. But Twerp did perform as the voice of Doc on one of the radio shows. Sterling Holloway was considered to be Sleepy, but instead Pinto Colvig, who's also behind Goofy's Guffaws, so Pinto Colvig was cast as Sleepy instead of Sterling Holloway. Sneezy was also a replacement for Jumpy. All the dwarfs were modeled after real people. So each of these funny-looking faces were modeled after real people. Now it is animated, so they kind of took liberty in more than one way, but still. So the $5 gag. To keep the animators' minds working, Walt instituted his $5 gag, which I think is still today, or it went on for years. So a good example of is when Ward Kimball suggested that the dwarf's nose should pop up one by one by one by one over the footboards, and so it goes choo 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 choo, and it's really funny and entertaining, and he got $5 because of that gag. Jiminy Crickets is mentioned 2 times by the dwarfs, and it's an old, and even though it was before Pinocchio came out, Jiminy Cricket is the cricket in Pinocchio. It's an old expression for surprise, and so people used Jiminy Crickets for any moment that they were surprised back then. When the dwarves are sent to wash up for dinner, animator Frank Thomas had Dopey do a hitch step to catch up with the others, as suggested in a storyboard. Disney liked it and had it added to other scenes, and so the other animators, had to do some extra work, and they blamed Frank Thomas for that, even though it wasn't his fault. When the dwarfs battle over Grumpy not wanting to wash up, and they go after him, Dopey swallows a bar of soap. A sequence showing how they got the soap out of him was filmed as a test for pencils, but it wasn't included. And so there was a scene where we are showed how Dopey gets the bar of soap out of his body, but it didn't actually happen. It was just a test it was called a pencil test. The 7 Dwarfs also later appeared in an educational short film, The Winged Scourge, in 1943. Sleepy and Bashful's beards are the longest, and Grumpy's is the shortest, and Dopey has none. When the dwarfs peer over the edge of the cliff, Grumpy's beard is actually suddenly surprisingly longer than the others. 6 of the dwarfs had eyebrows modeled after Walt. Happy is the exception. The dwarfs only have 4 fingers, 1 thumb, and 3 others. Bashful, and this isn't really a surprise, but Bashful is secretly in love with Snow White. Deanna Durbin had auditioned for the role of Snow White, but she wasn't chosen because Walt thought that her voice was too mature. And so Adriana Caselotti was cast. Fact number 42. Disney wanted to keep Snow White's voice unique and special, and so he held Adriana Caselotti to a strict contract. She couldn't be part in a play, musical, movie, or anything like that ever again. Even though she was classically trained voice musician, she did, however, I think, break this rule by having a very, very, very small part in The Wizard of Oz. To give Snow White a natural look, some of the ink and paint artists started to apply their own rouge on her cheeks. So here's how it happened. You have the paper that was drawn, and then the people are supposed to color, and then the female painters and inkers were supposed to color it in and make her look the way she was supposed to. And so they didn't want her to just look like that. And so they started to apply their own makeup, their own bronzer or rouge on her cheeks, or blush, whatever you want to call it, on her cheeks. And then they would send it to the cameraman, and the cameraman would take the pictures and everything. Fact number 44. Marge Champion was the movement model for Snow White. She is a dancer, and her movements were guided for Snow White. And she also married and divorced Arton Babbitt, an animator on the film. Fact number 46. The trees that grabbed Snow White's dress were based on unique Gary oak trees on southern Vancouver Island, British Columbia, and Canada. And the final fact for this video is Snow White, and I mentioned this in the earlier video, but Snow White is the only princess to be given this honor, but she has her own star on the Walk of Fame. Thanks for watching, and have a magical day!